Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 F1 Testing Debrief Show here on the BackMarkers F1 Show channel. We are here recapping Day 3, the final day of preseason testing, all the action and the events that happened today. I'm your host, Chris Cato, once again joining you for the last time on preseason testing. So we're going to go through all the day's events today and just summarize all of testing at the end of our show. So let's begin, as we have done in the last 2 days, by looking at the lap times and the lap counts so far of Day 3. A very interesting day of testing. We had a couple of hiccups once again, but we're going to get to that in just a little bit. Charles Leclerc setting the fastest time of the day today with a 1:30.3. He set that on the C5 tire, so the softest tire. Behind him, George Russell, he set this lap time fairly late, a 1:30.3, only 4/100ths of a second behind Leclerc. That was also set on the C4 tire. Zhou Guanyu for Sauber Stake, setting a 1:30.6 in P3, also on the soft, the C4 tire. Keep in mind, guys, that these C4 and C5 tires are actually not going to be available next week for the race in Bahrain, so keep that in mind. Max Verstappen, P4, a 30.7. That was set on the C3 tire actually a few hours ago, earlier in the day, and that was actually on a used set of C3, so a very strong lap by Verstappen. Tsunoda at P5 for RB. Alex Albon in the Williams. Both of those drivers using the soft compound tires to set their times. Oscar Piastri in the McLaren on 1:31.0. Set that on the C3. Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin finishing P8 on the day. Carlos Sainz in 9th. Rounding out the top 10, Sergio Perez, who drove in the morning for Red Bull. He was a 1:31.4. That was also on the harder tire. 1.1 seconds off of the pace. And then further down the field, Nico Hülkenberg actually setting a pretty fast time. We haven't seen a lot of performance runs from Haas, but they put on a set of C3s, and Nico Hülkenberg managed to get it up into P11. So not a bad time there from Haas. So now let's start to look at the lap count. So the amount of laps completed today by the teams and their drivers. You had 169 laps completed for Haas on Day 3, a tremendous amount of running so far for Haas F1 during these 3 days of testing. They are leading the lap counts, and they continued that consistency today. Second place, 145 laps for Ferrari. RB completed 123. Aston Martin with 121. Williams with another 121 as well. Red Bull, 119. Max Verstappen didn't complete as many laps as Sergio Perez did in the morning. Verstappen only 66 laps to his name, but still not a bad day's work. He was out of the car quite early at the end of the session as well. 116 laps for Mercedes, 113 for Sauber, McLaren at 111, and Alpine with 102. So all teams today managed to get over the 100 lap mark. And as we see here, before we move on to the day's events, a quick look at the speed trap top 10 here. Oscar Piastri leading the way at 325 kilometers an hour, not that far behind the Williams of Alex Albon and Nico Hülkenberg, 323. So most likely either running a little bit of a higher engine mode, more aggressive energy recovery deployment, or running DRS as well. But as you start to get further down in the field, Verstappen, for example, 4th fastest time on the day, 10th fastest in the speed traps at only 318 kilometers an hour. Same goes for Leclerc. He had the fastest time today, but only 8th on this speed trap. So as we said yesterday, most of these teams running on a very limited engine mode. And a lot of these teams also not even getting into 8th gear when we see on the straights. So those are your speed trap numbers there. And a very, very good week of testing for these teams, really all 10 teams. We only had a couple of mechanical and technical problems for some of these teams like the likes of Williams and McLaren, but other than that, probably one of the most smoothest preseason testings in recent memories. A lot of laps completed and also a lot of good data collected by all 10 teams, and we got to see plenty of action, and really the only hiccups came from the circuit itself, which we're going to get to in just a second or two. So a really good testing so far. Not a lot of performance runs that we saw. We were waiting for it on this final day of testing, and we got to see it at the end of Day 3 with Tsunoda and Albon and George Russell at the end. But the big teams, the likes of Red Bull, Aston Martin, even Mercedes and Ferrari, not really showing too much of their hand early on in testing. Now, as we spoke before about the reliability, we had a little bit of deja vu on Day 3, as it was on Day 2. Once again, the drain cover at turn 11 was coming loose, and it led to another delay, another red flag, and we lost a lot of the running in the early AM session, and it was almost the exact same spot as it was in day 2, a little bit further away, but they had to do extensive repairs again, and we had quite a few delays, which really hampered the running of a couple of drivers in the AM session. It was actually Sergio Perez who ran over it this time, and again, they had to bring the car into the garage, put it up on the sticks, and look at his floor to see if there was any damage. Luckily for the RB20 and Perez, there wasn't any extensive damage. It was looked over by the mechanics, and it was also looked over by Adrian Newey himself, the technical ace at Red Bull. He even got down and dirty and made sure that everything was okay with the RB20, and then Perez was able to continue on with his run. But because of that, they just got rid of the lunch hour and instead just did a continuous 8-hour session here on the final day. So it was very frustrating. I think Bahrain International Circuit should have done a lot better to prevent this happening. We were highly critical of the Las Vegas circuit last year, but to be fair to Las Vegas now, looking back in hindsight, that was their first race, and this is Bahrain's almost 20th year hosting Formula One. So this is something that they should have done better with, and they will be looking to make a more permanent fix for the race next week. And in the AM session, it was mostly once again Ferrari topping the time sheet, this time in the hands of Carlos Sainz. He was set the fastest time in the AM session, and Sainz completed 71 laps on the board. He had the fastest time of a 31.4, so a very solid day again for Carlos Sainz. He's had a really strong, positive winter testing so far, and he's shown great pace throughout. Now, one of the teams struggling so far in today's session, but also throughout the 3 days of testing, just with a couple of mechanical gremlins, is McLaren. The third day in a row that they had some sort of an issue, and it was this time on Lando Norris's car. So not only did we have the delay of the red flag, but we also had Lando Norris, who had an issue today with his clutch, and it limited his running to only 20 laps. As you see on the left-hand side of your screen, he only managed to complete 20 laps and did not finish inside of the top 10. So McLaren showed some good pace in testing, some good data on the long runs. They do look good, but just a couple of mechanical gremlins that hopefully they can fix by the time the race comes around next week. But let's move on to some good news with McLaren, as Oscar Piastri took over the car in the afternoon session. He set a time of a 1:31.0 early in the PM session, and that time was much faster than his qualifying time last year. So last year was a 1:32.1, and this session was a 1:31.0. So we're already seeing quite the improvement from McLaren from where they were 12 months ago. The MCL 38 is even a step forward from what we saw at the end of last season for McLaren. They were doing quite a lot of long runs. They did not even use the soft tires today, and we saw plenty of flow viz on the MCL 38 in the hands of Piastri. This was probably the most dramatic amount of flow viz that we saw on the car, on the left-hand side of the car, almost all the way through from the nose to the back of the engine cover, and they were doing various different aerodynamic tests with Piastri after he was doing his long run, so they were doing some more testing there. And I want to show you guys this from Albert Fabrega, who was in the pit lane, of course, providing us with some great pictures. Just some of the different design styles of the nose. We looked a little bit at the RB20 and the MCL 38 the other couple days, but here's some different looks at the nose. And we saw a lot of teams go to much wider, fatter noses this year. Red Bull's is still quite lean, same with Mercedes as well, but as we start to get into the midfield, you really notice a difference of the width of these noses, especially on the Alpine, and even on the Aston Martin as well. And then we see here on the Haas and the Williams. So it's interesting. We're seeing a lot of evolutions here on these cars, the third year of these ground effect regulations, but we're still seeing quite a few changes here, even though we are seeing some convergence of design for these teams. All right, now let's get into what was really the important part of the afternoon session was these race runs. Similar conditions like what we're going to see during the race with dusk going into nighttime. And let's take a look at Max Verstappen's stint on the C3 tires. So Max was really only doing race runs today other than for that used C3 performance run that he did. And if you look at his times here, very, very consistent, lapping in the low to mid 137s. But he actually kind of got faster through his stint, as you see here. Started off with a 37.7, 37.5, and as we get further down on his laps, a 37.1, and even well into the stint, he managed a 37.0, and after that was really staying below that 137.3 mark, so a very, very solid run on the C3 tires. The RB20's race pace looking very, very good, as well as their single lap pace too. Now let's compare that with Alonso's C3 race simulation, where he was lapping more in the mid to high 137. Started off with a 137.6, we saw him get up to a 38.0, but then after that kind of getting down to a consistent high minute 137.8 and 137.7 and 6. So definitely a lot slower than Max Verstappen, but the tire degradation was pretty good on the AMR 24 and not that far off from Max Verstappen. Of course, we don't know fuel loads and different things like that, but the AMR 24 race pace also looking not too bad at this point. Now let's move on to some harder tires. Charles Leclerc and the SF24 in the afternoon session, his C1 race simulation. Ferrari race pace looking much, much better than it did in 2023. It looks like they have solved some of those tire degradation issues, and their race pace does seem to be a genuine step forward from what it was last year. As you can see, his lap time here, lapping in the low to mid 136s, and very consistent as well for him too. Comparing that to Fernando Alonso's C1 race simulation, as you see here, a little bit slower there than Leclerc if we just pop back and forth between the two, but still, you can see a kind of comparison between the two drivers, and also here with Piastri's C1 simulation. More closer between McLaren and Aston Martin than it is with Ferrari. So these are really what were the highlights of testing, were these long runs, is we really didn't get to see much of the one-lap pace, but the race pace is really what's important. And for these teams, especially like Ferrari last year, who had such a quick car in qualifying, but suffered so much in the race, and it has been an improvement for them. But the question is it enough of an improvement to challenge the RB20, who is the clear favorite after the 3 days of testing? And the comments from inside the pit lane, from drivers, from journalists and pundits alike, is that Red Bull will be the team to beat. Fernando Alonso going as far as to say that 19 drivers already know they won't win the 2024 F1 title, I think implying that Max Verstappen is the clear favorite this season, and I think that he's absolutely right in this case. And we also see that McLaren and Oscar Piastri had the exact same feelings as well. He says, quote, "I certainly don't feel at the moment we're in a position to challenge Red Bull. I'm not sure anyone on the grid particularly feels that way at the moment." So despite some really good progress by these teams, I think that catching Red Bull is a different league at the moment, thanks to all of the changes that Red Bull managed to do with that RB20. So let's wait and see. The first race of the season is only 7 days away, so we're not going to have to wait long to see what the truth is. The good news, I think, if you're a fan of Formula One, is that all 10 teams have significantly improved their cars, from the likes of Williams to Sauber to Aston Martin. All of these teams have included a step forward, but I do not think it will be enough to catch Red Bull in the end. How big the gap will be, we're not sure. We're going to have to wait and see. But all in all, we can summarize 2024 F1 preseason testing as a resounding success for all 10 teams and their 20 drivers. Clearly, you have to look at some of the winners being Red Bull, who had a very solid test, completed a really healthy amount of laps, and I think got all the data and information that they wanted. Mercedes had a stronger showing toward the end of the test, collecting good data and also showing a little bit of the performance there at the end with George Russell. And we have also RB. RB had a very solid testing, completing a lot of laps. They did another 123 today, and also showing that they're going to be much, much more competitive than they were in 2023. Really calling that midfield is going to be extremely difficult this year, because I think RB has made quite a few steps forward. So bad news for their rivals in the midfield. Now, some of the unknowns, or I guess we could say some of the losers of winter testing, you certainly have to look at a team like Alpine, for example. I mean, if you look at the timing charts there on the right side of your screen, they're really nowhere at the moment, right? You have Pierre Gasly down in P15, Esteban Ocon down in P17. Okay, lap times don't mean much, but they really didn't show us much so far in testing this year. So it's very hard to predict where they are going to end up. And another team like Haas, for example, yes, they weren't focusing on performance this season in preseason testing, but we're not exactly sure where they're going to be in both race pace and in terms of qualifying pace as well. So that's a big question mark. And how that whole midfield is going to rank out. Sauber is another big question. We don't know where they're going to be. Clearly, Aston Martin is another strong car this year, a step forward from the AMR 23, but we're not sure if they're going to be able to replicate the early season success that they had in 2023. And up at the front, really the chasing pack behind Red Bull. From what I've seen so far in the 3 days of testing, it does look like Ferrari right now is the second best team, but it's very close with McLaren, and I think Mercedes might be fighting for that third, maybe even P4 spot, depending on where Aston Martin is at the moment. But I do think, despite some of the mechanical gremlins from McLaren, I do think that they are right there with Ferrari for the second fastest team. But clearly, Red Bull are in a league of their own, and we'll just have to wait and see until lights go out in Bahrain to see where exactly they're going to be. Are they going to be out in the distance too far to catch, or actually will we get some surprises? But that's going to do it for me here, guys, on the BackMarkers F1 show, the preseason testing debrief show. I've really enjoyed bringing these to you guys in the last 3 days. So comment down below your thoughts, your opinions, how you summarize 2024 winter testing, and maybe some predictions as well. We can finally kind of do some predictions after we've seen all these cars, 24 hours of running in the last 3 days. But we will be here soon back on the channel with our 2024 season preview podcast. So join us for that, and also the race preview for the Bahrain Grand Prix next week. I really appreciate the support, guys, from the last couple of days. Make sure you like this video, subscribe, and share it as well so we can get our channel out there even more. We hope you guys enjoyed our coverage for winter testing this season, and we'll be back with you again soon as we get set for the first race of 2024. I've been your host, Chris Cato. Until next time, bye for now. Have a good day, guys.